Being a pilot was once deemed the most dangerous occupation of the First World War, and if it was considered deadlier than life in the trenches, it revealed just how perilous the skies had become. Yet, even with staggering losses in combat, more airmen perished during training than in battle itself. These were the pioneers of combat aviation, men who paid in blood for every lesson learned. At one point, the demand for pilots was so desperate that recruits with barely 10 hours of solo flight were sent to the front, where their life expectancy rarely exceeded 2 weeks. This is the story of the first combat aviators, men who sacrificed everything to advance the art of war in the air. For the first time in history, aircraft would play a decisive role in conflict, forever binding themselves to the military, evolving, but never departing. Yet in 1914, aviation was still in its infancy. Only a decade had passed since the Wright brothers' first flight, and many generals saw little use for such fragile machines. They had no idea how wrong they were. As the war erupted, cavalry charges and swift maneuvers met walls of machine gun fire. Artillery became bogged down in the mud, and the deadlock of trench warfare began. In this grim stalemate, those flimsy constructions of wood, wire, and canvas took to the skies, serving as the Army's new eyes above the battlefield. Their impact was immediate. British pilots near Mons spotted a German flanking maneuver and warned their comrades just in time to avoid disaster. During the First Battle of the Marne, aircraft located breaches in German lines and guided counterattacks that halted the enemy advance. By September 1914, airplanes had become the most vital source of real-time intelligence for every army involved. But still, no one could yet imagine what these fragile machines, and the men who flew them, were about to become. At the dawn of the war, the great powers possessed what could only be described as modest air forces. France had just 141 military aircraft, Germany 295, and Britain managed to send barely 50 planes to France in 1914. Yet within only a few short years, those numbers would surge into the tens of thousands. Constant aerial observation soon became a defining feature of the conflict. It stripped armies of surprise, turning open battle into a static nightmare of trenches and barbed wire. The sky had become the enemy of secrecy. Photographic reconnaissance quickly proved indispensable. Every change in the enemy's defenses could now be captured, studied, and used to plan deadly precision attacks. But observation was only the beginning. Early in the war, reconnaissance planes from opposing sides often crossed paths high above the front. At first, these encounters were curiously polite. Pilots would simply nod, wave, and part ways. Yet that brief moment of chivalry would not last. For whoever controlled the skies controlled the battlefield below. Very soon, pilots would do anything to protect their own observers and destroy those of the enemy. Thus emerged the pursuit plane, the fighter, its sole purpose to hunt and destroy. But before these agile predators could dominate the air, the pioneers faced immense technical challenges. Early reconnaissance aircraft were unarmed, their pilots carrying little more than a pistol. Still, they fought with desperate ingenuity. A French crew was the first to open fire from the air, wounding a German two-seater and damaging its craft. Just 2 weeks later, a Russian pilot rammed an Austrian plane mid-air, scoring the first recorded aerial kill, and losing his life in the process. Then, on October 5, 1914, the first true dogfight unfolded. A French two-seater armed with a flexible Hotchkiss machine gun engaged a German plane that returned fire with rifles. The French gun jammed after 2 magazines, and the battle continued with small arms until a bullet pierced the German fuel tank, sending it spiraling to the earth in flames. The age of aerial combat had begun, a deadly new theater of war. But for now, these fragile machines still struggled to carry both man and weapon, their engines unreliable, their speed rarely exceeding 80 miles per hour. There was little these fragile machines could endure. The logical weapon was a machine gun, yet the question remained, where could it possibly be mounted? The wings were too delicate to bear the weight, and the pilot couldn't reach them to reload or clear jams. Mounting the gun beside or ahead of him meant firing directly through the spinning propeller, risking the destruction of his own aircraft. That didn't stop daring pilots from trying. Some succeeded in firing through the propeller arc, though always at terrible risk. Others mounted guns above the blades, but aiming proved nearly impossible. It became clear that a forward-firing machine gun was the only practical solution, yet the obstacle of the propeller still loomed unsolved. The British experimented with pusher aircraft, designs that placed the propeller at the rear, leaving the front clear for a gunner. While this allowed unobstructed fire, it came at a heavy price. The design was aerodynamically unstable, slower, and less maneuverable than the traditional tractor planes with front-mounted propellers. By the end of 1914, no side had found a true answer. Aerial battles were still improvised duels, relying more on the creativity and courage of aircrews than on engineering. Of the roughly 800 aircraft in service, dozens had already crashed and countless pilots had perished, mostly from mechanical failure or ground fire rather than combat. But as 1915 dawned, the war in the skies was about to change forever. The key would come from one man, a French pilot named Roland Garros. Seeking a way to fire through his propeller, he fixed small steel wedges to its blades, designed to deflect any bullets that struck them. Risky, ingenious, and surprisingly effective. Garros shot down 3 German aircraft using this crude innovation before fate caught up with him. Engine trouble forced him to land behind enemy lines, his plane damaged, perhaps by deflected rounds. Captured along with his machine, Garros inadvertently handed the future to his enemies. His aircraft was studied by German engineers, and soon the brilliant designer Anthony Fokker improved upon the idea. His solution, the interrupter gear, synchronized the machine gun with the propeller's rotation. The weapon could now fire cleanly through the propeller arc, pausing only when a blade crossed its path. This single invention, the interrupter gear, revolutionized air combat overnight. Within weeks, it unleashed what would soon be known as the Fokker Scourge. On July 1, 1915, German Lieutenant Kurt Wintgens achieved history's first synchronized gun victory, shooting down a French aircraft after a brief chase. His plane, the Fokker Eindecker, was a single-seat monoplane armed with a fixed Spandau machine gun, the first aircraft built from the ground up as a true fighter. From that moment, Fokker fighters dominated the skies. The Germans held absolute air superiority, cutting through slower Allied two-seaters with ruthless precision. It was during this era that the first aces emerged. Pilots who claimed 5 or more confirmed kills, transforming the lone aviator into a new kind of warrior. Desperate to regain control, the Allies scrambled for an answer. The French developed the nimble Nieuport Bebe, mounting a Lewis gun on its upper wing, while the British persisted with their cumbersome pusher designs. Yet none could rival the efficiency of the Eindecker. Ground-based anti-aircraft guns were also introduced, but these crude weapons were far more likely to scare off an enemy plane than bring one down. Then, in April 1916, fortune turned. A damaged Eindecker was forced to land behind Allied lines in France. When engineers examined it, they finally discovered the German secret, the synchronization gear. Though the Allies had dabbled with similar concepts, none had worked so flawlessly. Now, with the design in hand, they copied and refined it. The French soon developed an even more reliable hydraulic version, and for the first time in months, the balance of power in the sky began to shift. But beyond the dogfights and engineering breakthroughs, the reality of flying in World War I was a torment all its own. Even without enemy fire, pilots faced brutal conditions. By the later stages of the war, aircraft could climb to 20,000 feet, where the air thinned and oxygen faded. Many pilots grew dizzy or blacked out from hypoxia, leading to the first crude oxygen masks and tanks. Engines were lubricated with castor oil, which filled the cockpit with fumes. The oil's laxative effect caused nausea and diarrhea, and indignity endured in open cockpits at freezing altitudes. Temperatures often plunged below -30 degrees, and frostbite was common. The roar and vibration of the engine could leave a pilot partially deaf, his ears ringing long after landing. Yet none of these hardships compared to the greatest terror of all, fire. Fuel tanks were placed above and in front of the pilot. A single leak or spark could ignite the entire plane. Surrounded by canvas, wood, and gasoline, every man who took to the sky knew that a single bullet could turn his craft into a burning coffin. It was only ever a matter of time before fire erupted. Aircraft fabric was coated in highly flammable varnish, and even a single tracer round could turn a plane into an inferno. At high altitude, there was little a pilot could do once flames took hold, except decide how to end his suffering. Many carried revolvers for that very reason, knowing precisely when and why they might use them. Some chose a different fate. There are accounts of pilots leaping from burning aircraft without parachutes, preferring the quick fall to the agony of fire. One such man was the French aviator Raoul Berry, who jumped from 3,000 feet when his plane was consumed by flames. Safety measures were almost non-existent. Seatbelts, for instance, only became standard after a pilot literally fell out of his aircraft and died. And as for parachutes, they were practically absent from cockpits for most of the war. Balloon crews used them successfully, but airplane pilots rarely had the same privilege. The Germans were the first to issue parachutes, though they were heavy, clumsy, and only worked about 60% of the time. Even so, they saved some 70 lives. The British, astonishingly, introduced them only after the war, some historians suggesting commanders feared that pilots would abandon their aircraft too soon if given the chance. By mid-1917, the life expectancy of a British pilot at the front was roughly 3 weeks. During brutal periods such as Bloody April, losses reached staggering levels. One squadron lost 13 of its 18 pilots in a single month, while their inexperienced replacements rarely survived even that long. In 1917 alone, more pilots were killed than in all previous years of the war combined. The British lost around 14,000 airmen, the French 3,500, and the Germans about 5,000. Though small compared to the slaughter in the trenches, the percentage of losses among air crews was devastatingly high, far greater than that of infantry officers. Yet, despite the danger, air power proved indispensable. Each side constantly pushed innovation forward. One breakthrough would briefly tip the balance, only for the enemy to counter it with a new design. It was an endless cycle, a deadly game of adaptation. And amid this struggle, one seemingly simple invention became one of the most decisive aircraft of the war: the observation balloon. These great gas-filled sentinels floated high above the front, tethered by cables and filled with hydrogen, light enough to lift them, but perilously flammable. From several thousand feet in the air, observers had a sweeping view of the battlefield. Through telephone lines or early wireless sets, they directed artillery fire with astonishing accuracy, guiding each shell until it struck home. Unlike airplanes, which were limited by range and endurance, these kite balloons could remain aloft for hours, silent watchers charting every movement below and shaping the outcome of battles from the heavens. Observation balloons became so vital that entire sectors of the Western Front were often defined by how many each side possessed. Their presence, or absence, could determine control of the battlefield below. But being filled with hydrogen, they were also deadly hazards, giant, floating bombs. Once incendiary ammunition became common, it took only a single burst from an enemy fighter to ignite them in a blinding fireball. Balloon busting quickly became one of the most dangerous missions a pilot could undertake. These targets were fiercely defended, surrounded by rings of anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and patrolling fighters. Many who set out to destroy them never returned. The observers inside, prime targets themselves, were among the few airmen granted parachutes during the war. When attacked, they would leap from their burning balloons, drifting to safety as their craft exploded above. Then came the Zeppelins, the long shadowed arm of Germany's strategic air campaign. Massive, majestic, and terrifying, these airships carried more than a ton of explosives, far beyond what any airplane could manage at the time, and could travel hundreds of miles to strike deep behind enemy lines. For Britain, their arrival was a shock beyond comprehension. The first Zeppelin raids brought the war directly to civilians, a horror unseen in modern history. The psychological effect was immense. But like the balloons, Zeppelins had a fatal flaw: hydrogen. Once hit, they became monstrous torches in the night sky. Entire crews of 30 or more perished as the flaming giants fell to Earth. Spectacular shootdowns over Britain turned what was meant to be a terror weapon into a liability. By 1917, most Zeppelins were withdrawn from bombing missions, used instead for reconnaissance over the North Sea, where the threat of fighters was lower. Still, Germany did not abandon the dream of strategic bombardment. They shifted focus to heavy bombers, the Gothas, and later the massive giants, continuing to rain destruction over British cities. As 1918 arrived, the air war reached its final feverish stage. Aircraft had evolved beyond recognition. The German Fokker D-7 biplane, powered by a BMW engine, was so superior that after the armistice, Germany was ordered to surrender every single one. The British answered with the Sopwith Snipe, twin Vickers guns, a powerful Bentley engine, and unmatched maneuverability. What began as light scouting missions had become full-scale aerial warfare, with ground attacks, strategic bombing, naval patrols, and even night fighting. In just 4 years, the airplane had transformed from a fragile experiment into a decisive weapon of war. The technological leap was astonishing, yet it was only the beginning. These lessons, paid for in courage and blood, would pave the way for the next global conflict, where the skies themselves would become the ultimate battlefield. If you want more historical content like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share it with your friends, and drop a comment below. Your support helps us create even more stories from the past.